only extended first-person account attributed to Nat Turner was not written down by Nat Turner. November 10, 1831. In the District of Columbia, a Virginia lawyer named Thomas R. Gray, a man who defended several of the accused in the Southampton trials, though never Turner, deposits the title of a book for copyright, and the clerk of the court records his claim to it, in the record's own word, as proprietor, the law's word for the person who owns a thing. The book, The Confessions of Nat Turner. The same Gray who, by his own account, had ready access to Turner's cell and committed his statements to writing. Nat Turner was hanged the next day. So before you've read a single word of this document, you have to sit with this. The voice on the page is attributed to Turner. The copyright was claimed as proprietor by the man on the other side of the table, and the question of whose words these really are will travel with us the whole way. And that's not just a fact about 1831. It changes how we read the story we inherit, the gloomy fanatic, the bewildered mind. It changes how we read records that power produces about the people they hold. So here's the question this episode lives inside. How do you read the only extended record we have of a man's voice when the record was made by the people who hanged him? And I mean that collectively. Taken down and published by the lawyer who visited his cell, acknowledged before the court that sentenced him as full, free, and voluntary, an attestation of his acknowledgement and nothing about the pen, printed for a public Gray himself describes as greatly excited. What comes through that the frame could not contain? We'll start with the container Gray built, then the voice inside it, then the march, and then the moment the whole thing cracks open, on a 4-word answer the pamphlet places at its center. Start with what the pamphlet says it's for. Gray tells you himself, right in the preface, address to the public. The Southampton uprising, he tells his readers, has the public's mind in a state of high excitement, rumors everywhere. So he'll gratify public curiosity. He'll remove doubts and conjectures. And, third purpose, he'll demonstrate that the laws restraining the enslaved population ought to be strictly and rigidly enforced. Curiosity, calm, enforcement. He does advertise fidelity, a faithful record, one stamp of truth and sincerity. But look at what the stated purposes center: reassurance and enforcement. Fidelity, in this preface, reads like the warranty on the product, not the purpose of it. Then he introduces the man whose words he's about to sell. Gray writes, quote, "A gloomy fanatic was revolving in the recesses of his own dark, bewildered, and overwrought mind schemes of indiscriminate massacre to the whites." End quote. Bewildered, overwrought, dark. The frame arrives before the voice does. And the fanatic story matters, because if Turner's a fanatic, a one-man storm of religious madness, then the revolt is a pathology, not a symptom. It began in one strange mind, it died on one gallows, and the institution never has to answer a single question. Gray offers the containment himself, quote, "If Nat's statements can be relied on, the insurrection in this county was entirely local, and his designs confided but to a few." End quote. Hear what that sentence is doing. One county, a handful of men, nothing organized beyond it. A one-county storm, if his prisoner can be believed. His next clause even gestures at something wider, fanaticism acting on materials too well prepared, and then stops. Because naming what prepared those materials would mean naming slavery. And notice he never says relax. The same preface demands the restraining laws rigidly enforced, every community watching its own. The calm he sells is a vigilant calm. And the lone madman story protects more than it explains. If the cause is one skull, the system is innocent. The question a careful reader asks isn't whether the explanation is comforting, it's who the comfort is for. But the container leaks, and it leaks from Gray's own pen. Same preface, same man, and he concedes this, quote, "It was not instigated by motives of revenge or sudden anger, but the results of long deliberation and a settled purpose of mind," end quote. Read those two sentences next to each other. A bewildered mind and a settled purpose of mind. The strange part, Gray doesn't hide the tension, he fuses it, calling the settled purpose the offspring of gloomy fanaticism. Deliberation and madness, welded into one diagnosis. And be careful, those aren't strict opposites. A person can be deliberate and disturbed at once, and a hostile published account supports no diagnosis in either direction. What the second sentence strains isn't a medical claim, it's the story's function. A bewildered mind is an accident, and accidents don't indict institutions. But a settled purpose is a cause, and a cause has conditions, and conditions have owners. And here's the trap Gray built for himself. He needs both stories at once. He needs Turner authentic and coherent. Otherwise, the pamphlet is worthless as a record and as a publication. And he needs Turner incomprehensible. Otherwise, the questions travel past one man to the institution that made him. So the pamphlet authenticates and dismisses in the same breath. And that contradiction isn't a flaw in the document. It is the document. One more caution before we step inside, and keep it in your pocket. Every word of Turner you're about to hear reaches you through a text Gray says he committed to writing. Which sentences are transcription and which are composition? The pamphlet never lets you decide. Neither will I. Now step past the preface and listen to the voice it was built to hold. The published narration begins in childhood, and notice the seam right at the doorway. Gray claims Turner commenced without being questioned at all. Then the narration opens by answering a request. "Sir, you have asked me," and before its first sentence is out, it pushes back on the very word for what happened, the insurrection, as you call it. Even the opening can't agree on who prompted it, and the voice inside it is already contesting the vocabulary. Then the voice starts building a self with total assurance. A child telling other children about things that happened before he was born, while the adults stand around astonished, saying the Lord had shown him things. A boy who learns to read, and in his own telling, can't remember learning. Somebody hands him a book to stop him crying, and he starts spelling the names of the objects in it. He runs experiments, casting things in molds made of earth, paper, gunpowder, and Gray, whose commentary swings between hostile diagnosis and something close to admiration, adds a footnote confirming that when questioned about those experiments, Turner was found well-informed on the subject. The same commentary will concede, before the pamphlet is done, a mind capable of attaining anything, an intelligence surpassed by few men its author had ever seen. The frame indicts itself in its own vocabulary. Then comes the sentence that should stop you cold. Turner says it was remarked of him as a child by the people around him, his own master among them. Turner recalled it this way, quote, "I had too much sense to be raised, and if I was, I would never be of any service to anyone as a slave," end quote. What that sentence admits is narrow and enormous at once. Too much sense to be raised. The people around him, his own master among them, living inside the institution, looked at a bright black child and said out loud that this particular mind would never stay useful inside slavery. Hear the exact shape of that admission. Not that he deserved freedom, that his intelligence and his enslavement were on a collision course, and everyone standing there could see it. The whole pamphlet is the record of the collision, and what stays with me is how casual it was. A thing said around a child, the way people talk about weather. And then the visions. White spirits and black spirits at war in a darkened sky. Blood running in streams. Blood on the corn. Hieroglyphic characters on the leaves. A revelation he dates to 1825. Then, on the 12th of May, 1828, the commission. The spirit telling him the serpent was loosened, that he should take up the yoke Christ had laid down, and that he must conceal it until a sign appeared in the heavens. Gray hears all of this and hands you a single word, fanatic. And give that word its strongest case, because it has one. An eclipse read as a command to kill is not a small thing. A hostile account supports no diagnosis in either direction, and honesty means saying so. If the argument here rested on the visions feeling reasonable, it would fail. It doesn't rest there. Look at the content instead of the temperature. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. A yoke laid down by the Savior and taken up by an enslaved man. That's not noise. That's a theology. Precise, biblical, and aimed. It speaks in the prophet's register. The voice of a man claiming an authority that comes from heaven and not from any owner. And read the narration's self-presentation. That is the one authority nobody inside it manages to take from him. Not the overseer, not the revilers at the baptism, not Gray in the cell. And notice the discipline underneath it. The narrative places years between that command and the first blow. Years spent waiting on the sky. The eclipse of February 1831 arrives, and the group sets a date, the 4th of July. The date passes. He's sick, and the plans keep forming and getting rejected. Does that sound like the bewildered mind of the preface? Waiting years for the sky to move? Something is surviving the frame here. Something specific, dateable, deliberate. And its survival isn't an accident, or at least the pamphlet's own front matter suggests why. Gray stakes the pamphlet's usefulness on his fidelity claim, quote, with little or no variation from his own words, end quote, and prints a court certificate behind it. Note the certificate's limit. It says Turner acknowledged the confession. It says nothing about whose pen shaped the sentences. And why advertise fidelity at all unless credibility was doing the load-bearing work? So the record had an interest in carrying its prisoner's voice, and that interest is the crack everything else gets through. Then there's the part of the record that the comfortable version of this story on either side would rather skip, the revolt itself. It begins on a Sunday night in late August 1831, and its organized force starts breaking apart by Tuesday morning. The pamphlet's own list of the murdered totals 55, printed family by family, down to the children. Mrs. Levi Waller and 10 children are on that list, and the attributed narration records an infant in a cradle at the first house, forgotten, then killed on a return trip. When the march reaches the Whitehead family, and the account follows Margaret Whitehead as she flees, the instinct is to look away from what happens next. I'm going to name that instinct instead of obeying it, because the pamphlet is asking us to see two things at once, and most readers only manage one. The attributed narration carries all of it with a composure that plainly unsettled the man recording it. It has him view the dead, in its words, in silent satisfaction. It gives his object as carrying terror and devastation wherever they went. The stated rule, quote, neither age nor sex was to be spared, end quote, and the pamphlet closes the question in a parenthesis, which was invariably adhered to. 5 words whose authorship, like everything here, cannot be fully separated. And then, in the middle of this account, he says the thing that nobody recording it was equipped to hear. Turner said of the man whose house the revolt began at, quote, who was to me a kind master, and placed the greatest confidence in me. In fact, I had no cause to complain of his treatment to me." End quote. That quote is not scenery. It removes the one motive everyone reaches for first: mistreatment. The narration puts Joseph Travis's death in the first minutes of the first attack. The two halves of that sit in the same account: a kind master and the first blow. What follows is my reading, and one sentence about one man's kindness can't carry it alone. But the reading has more than one leg. In his commentary, Gray records that Turner was, quote, "never known to have $1 in his life, to swear an oath, or drink a drop of spirits," end quote. In his preface, Gray himself rules out revenge and sudden anger. And the object, the narration states, isn't a grievance. It's a program. Terror and devastation, neither age nor sex. Put the pieces together, and the kind master sentence stops being a detail and becomes a thesis. On this reading, kindness couldn't buy safety because kindness was never the issue. And the revolt wasn't aimed at one man's cruelty, but at slavery itself. And if a kind master could not be safe, then no version of the good master defense was ever going to hold. That is the argument the sentence opens the door to. And in the trial account Gray prints, the court's chairman, Jeremiah Cobb, reaches for the same idea and turns the remembered kindness into an aggravation. A master, the speech claims in Turner's own language, too indulgent. Except the attributed confession never says that. It says, kind master. Two incompatible characterizations of one man's words inside one pamphlet. The speech recasts the attributed word, and the pamphlet gives you no way to reconcile the two. Which is this whole episode in miniature? All of it, as Gray's pamphlet prints it, one more layer of the same volume. Even so, and this is my reading of the page, the system heard the fact and couldn't afford the meaning. And this is where the reading discipline matters most, because there's a use of this horror that ends thought. It says, 55 dead, many of them children, therefore there's nothing here to understand. And let me be exact, because grief for the dead is not complicity with anything. Explanation is not exculpation. Hold on to that tension, because a second comfortable reading is coming, one that fails it from the other side. This pamphlet demands the names read and the mind examined at once. But when the horror is used to stop every explanation at the word fanatic, that move is the one the preface itself performs, and it protects the institution more than it honors the dead. Agency and atrocity sit in the same hands. Now watch the record strain. By Gray's own account, he was in that cell across several days, taking the narrative down, questioning a chained man he had, in his own words, assured of the certain death that awaited him. Every advantage in that cell runs one way: chains, enslavement, legal peril, and the other man holds the pen. The visions, the signs, the spirit, the great work, all of it has ended in defeat, suspected betrayal, capture. And at a point the pamphlet never dates, placed by the printed text in the middle of the 1828 commission, the narration breaks into bare question and answer. The text interrupts the narration with a question, quote, "Do you not find yourself mistaken now?" End quote. And then the recorded answer, quote, "Was not Christ crucified?" End quote. 4 words. The question invites a condemned man to admit the whole thing was a delusion, and the answer converts the gallows into Calvary without raising its voice. Remember the caution in your pocket. The exchange reads like transcription: bare question and bare answer, the most compressed of the pamphlet's recorded exchanges. It could still be composition. I know of no test inside this pamphlet that separates them. Hold that and look at what the moment does anyway. It sits in the middle of the very document printed to contain this man, and it hands him the last word of that exchange. In the grammar the narration has been speaking all along, the defeat isn't evidence against the calling. The defeat reads as the calling. That answer is where the two comfortable readings of this book both come apart, and I have to turn on each of them because they're wrong in the same way. The first is Gray's, the one we inherit. Turner, the gloomy fanatic, contained, diagnosed, closed. The second is the mirror image, and I'll put it conditionally. Any retelling that lets the axe and the list of 55 drop out of the story builds the opposite cell. Turner, the spotless martyr. Both decide what the man is allowed to be before he speaks. The pamphlet demands something harder, and it only works as a conditional. Whatever in this text is truly Turner's, the frame did not contain it. The frame carried it. Shaped by another hand, yes, but carried. Gray's project needed the confession accepted as authentic to make its calm believable. And so the container had to carry the very things it was built to explain away. The deliberation, the theology, the four-word answer. The document works against its own purpose every time someone actually reads it. That's the turn. And it stands as a reading. Not that the frame lies, but that the frame couldn't afford to lie enough. One phrase shows you why the doubt stays live inside the turn. When the attributed narration surveys the dead, it says he viewed them in silent satisfaction. Whose phrase is that? It reads like a confession's voice, and it reads like a prosecutor's flourish. That undecidability is not a footnote to my reading. It's the price of it. Gray felt something. His commentary never resolves it. The same pages call his face fiend-like, then offer an either-or that refuses to choose. A complete fanatic, or a man who plays his part most admirably. And then hand you this. Gray wrote in his own commentary, quote, "Yet daring to raise his manacled hands to heaven, with the spirit soaring above the attributes of man, I looked on him, and my blood curdled in my veins." End quote. His blood curdled. I hear fear and awe sharing one sentence, and the diagnosis sharing the page with that soaring, more than human spirit. That is not a man calmly cataloging a specimen, which tells you the frame was never only propaganda. In sentences like that one, it reads like a man talking himself down. And then the state answers with its own liturgy. The trial came on November 5th, and the pamphlet presents it in one compressed account. The gallows waited 6 days more. Turner pleads not guilty, and the pamphlet records his reason. He told his counsel that he did not feel guilty. The judgment climaxes with the word dead, spoken 3 times, then commends his soul to mercy in the same breath. And after the sentence, the pamphlet closes with 2 lists. Honestly, the list may be its plainest pages, less florid than Gray's commentary, though no less framed. One is headed, Persons Murdered. The other files Human Beings by Owner. First, the murdered, a list totaling 55. Then, the people brought before the court, convicted, acquitted, discharged without trial, sent on for further trial, and a handful of free men marked simply free. And read the structure of that second list. For the enslaved, 3 fields, a name, an owner, a verdict. Daniel, Richard Porter, convicted. Some entries read convicted and transported. The heading says it plainly, with their owners' names and sentence. Ownership is a required field. which makes this one list two documents at once: a court docket, an inventory. And the last line of the ledger reads, Nat Turner, Putnam Moore, deceased, convicted. The middle field is an owner. Even the final administrative entry identifies him through the man who held him. The revolt against the ledger is filed in the ledger. And the book carrying the confession, remember, entered one more ledger, the copyright record of the District of Columbia, under Gray's claim, in the record's own word, as proprietor, the day before Turner died. So, the question we've carried the whole way. How do you read the only extended account we have of a man's voice when the record was made by the people who hanged him? Here's the answer this episode has earned. You read it twice. A voice attributed to Turner on one side, Gray's editorial and legal frame on the other, and courts, certificates, and printers pressing in between. And when you do, on the reading this episode has argued, what survives the hostile pen is precisely what it was built to contain: a deliberate mind, an unbroken theology, a revolt aimed at the institution itself, not at its cruelties. That's a claim you can test against the pamphlet's own sentences. The settled purpose, Gray concedes, the years of waiting, the kind master whose house was attacked first. But the same method that recovers Turner's mind hands you an obligation with it. The printed list of 55 dead is in the same pamphlet, 10 of them, children of one family. A reading that restores a man's agency restores his accountability in the same motion. And anyone who wants to profit without the axe is building a cell of their own, just with better intentions. And here's the honest edge of the whole exercise. If the double reading is right, then a record like this one can be made to testify against its own author, and documents handed down to us as verdicts start giving up the people inside them. But if Gray's pen reached deeper than we can detect, if the polish and those long, lawyerly sentences mean he composed more than he transcribed, then less of Turner survives here than we hope, and the reading gets harder. Though even heavy mediation does not erase a man, it blurs him, and I won't rush past that, because it's the strongest objection to this entire episode, the possibility that these minutes have been spent recovering a voice that is, sentence by sentence, partly its jailer's invention. I can't rule that out from inside this pamphlet. Here's where I actually rest, and it's a judgment, not a proof. Take the details that cut against the frame: the kind master, the settled purpose, the four-word answer. Every one of them can be bent to serve Gray's story. The kindness becomes ingratitude. The purpose becomes proof of fanaticism. The answer becomes extremity on display. But to use them at all, the frame had to print them, and once printed, they sit available to every reader the preface cannot supervise. Which is why, for this reader at least, the preface has never managed to have the last word. So I hold a graded confidence, not a verdict. Some of this voice is Turner's. We cannot always say which sentences. The discipline is knowing, at every sentence, which possibility you're trusting. Go back to where we started, the copyright ledger, and set it beside the trial ledger we ended on. The pamphlet's final entry identifies him through a deceased owner. Its four-word answer meets a question with a question. Between those two sentences sits everything this document couldn't decide. And nearly 2 centuries later, that undecided space is where the reading actually happens.